Hi Year 10 and welcome to your second lesson this week. This continues pretty much from your first lesson on vaccines, so if you've not watched that, make sure you go ahead and do. Today we're going to look at all about how we develop vaccines and the stages in which they go through in order for us to ensure that they're safe. And these stages aren't just true for vaccines, they're true for absolutely every pharmaceutical, every drug that you've ever taken. They've all gone through these same testing process. So we said last lesson that vaccines are about injecting ourselves with an inactive or dead version of a pathogen. But how do we know this is safe? There's lots of talk at the moment about the COVID vaccine potentially not being safe. Well, today we're going to look at all the stages that vaccine and every other pharmaceutical's been through in order to ensure that it is safe. So when developing a new vaccine or any new medicine, there are 4 key stages that they have to go through before they make it to market and make it into your body. And if you think how a company might go about developing a new medicine, there are millions, if not billions, of possible chemicals that might potentially alleviate symptoms or be a cure. And so they've got to start by casting the net wide before coming to one very specific drug that you can then administer to yourself. And in order to cast this net wide, they start by doing something called computer trials. And this is where they run simulations to see whether a drug is likely to work or not. At this point, it hasn't come into contact with anything living at all. If it passes this trial and it looks promising, it goes on to do something called tissue testing. And this is where they take the active ingredient of that drug and they introduce it to some tissue samples or cell samples. It's still not exactly living because they can grow these cells artificially, and so nothing needs to come into any harm. If it passes this trial, this is where it moves on to by far the most controversial stage of this, which is animal testing. And in the UK, any drug that we are able to take has to pass through at least 2 mammals before it can make it to market. It has to be deemed safe on 2 living mammals. Rats are often used for this because they grow very quickly, which means they can be killed and replaced very easily. This stage is all about checking that they're safe, checking that that rat or whatever animal doesn't drop dead the second the drug is administered. And finally, if it passes that stage, this is where clinical trials can really begin. And clinical trials really just means human trials. And it starts off by being tested on very few healthy volunteers. In fact, you get paid to do this. And then if it passes that stage, the number of volunteers they take gets gradually bigger and bigger and bigger. Once it has been tested on enough people, it becomes made available to market, and then finally made available to everyone. And this is why you shouldn't have any worries about taking the coronavirus vaccine. It's passed through all these stages and it is extremely safe. The only reason it's been done quicker is because they've spent absolutely loads of money on it, which has allowed them to accelerate it. They've not skipped any of these stages at all. It's as safe as any other pharmaceutical you could take. A really important thing to rule out when doing these drug testings is this idea of the placebo effect. The placebo effect is whereby which you take a drug and you report results because you expect it to work. So if you're told a drug will give you extra strength, you take it and you believe it, you might well feel that you feel a little bit stronger. But that drug doesn't contain any active ingredients. It is in your head, it is imagined. This can be really dangerous though, because if you think that a drug is having an effect that it isn't really, you might ignore other pharmaceuticals and other drugs that would have a positive effect. It's really important to know that the drug is actually doing something positive and that you're not just reporting them. There's no real explanation for why this happens. Science is a little bit baffled by it, but it's a very real phenomenon that occurs regardless of whether you're given a pill or injection, or even if you're exposed to a piece of machinery that has apparent miracle powers. In order to rule out the placebo effect, all drugs go through something called a double-blind trial. This is where that bunch of volunteers I mentioned earlier, only half are actually given the drug. The other half are given a placebo, which is generally just a sugar pill. This allows scientists to compare results between the 2 groups. What we want to happen is those that are taking the placebo show no result, report no positive effects, whereas those that are taking the real job report lots and lots of positive effects. The reason this is called a double-blind trial is no one knows who's taking the real drug and who's taking the placebo. That means the patient doesn't know, nor does the doctor administering it. This is really important because you don't want bias with your doctors. You don't want them reporting a drug works better than it does. And they might well have a reason for this. New drugs, make an awful lot of money for pharmaceutical companies. The COVID vaccine is reported to make about $12 billion for Pfizer. Good, so that's everything you need to know about developing new medicines. Hopefully that was all useful and you can now go answer some questions. Look forward to seeing you all in the live lesson this week, where we'll go over some of this information again, as well as adding a little bit to it.